So it gives me great pleasure and delight to both thank and introduce our guest today, Jordanne Edwards. To some of you, Jordanne is already a friendly face. She's been working with Roland and I, collaborating for almost 3 years now, and she was a visiting scholar here last year, where she conducted some of her field work for one of her case studies in Australia. Some of you might also remember she presented a seminar again last year on her case study taken from Luxembourg. She's now in her final year of her PhD, and it is with huge delight and excitement that we have been able to welcome her back. So for those of you who don't already know Jordanne, she's visiting from the University of Luxembourg, where she is a doctoral scholar based in the Institute of Social Research and Interventions. Originally from Jamaica, Jordanne has an extensive scholarly and also practitioner background, including having worked in UNESCO in Paris prior to her PhD. Jordanne's bachelor's and master's degrees span social work, sociology and human rights, and community development, and the latter of which, her master's degree, that is, she completed as a prestigious Erasmus Mundus scholar, studying across 4 countries in Europe. So Jordanne, and apologies if I'm going on a little while, but I am very delighted that Jordanne is back. Jordanne will describe herself as a social worker and international development professional. And while no doubt I'm sure this is spot on, as she knows herself best, I feel it is a very grounded way to talk about what is her incredibly thoughtful scholarship and the sensitivities she brings to her PhD material, and also working with the many individuals and communities who have helped to form some of her material for her PhD, who have helped to inspire. So Jordanne is pursuing, as you probably gathered, a highly interdisciplinary doctoral thesis that brings together, I think, the range of important and perhaps even urgent and pressing contemporary issues, including trauma, racial identity, racial violence, questions of narration and the construction of traumatic meaning, and also questions of continuing colonial histories and legacies. She does so in particular to try and understand how powerful discourses coming from anti-racism activism, what they tell us, what their knowledge tells us about society in particular, and the radical shifts we need to make into the future. We're extremely fortunate to have Jordanne return to stay, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to be joined with her now. I've definitely spoken for too long, so I'll hand over Jordanne to say a quick first hello, and perhaps tell a little bit about herself in her own words, and including her own research. So thank you very much, Jordanne.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone, and thank you so much for coming and for inviting me, Emma. So I think you pretty much covered most of what how I would introduce myself anyways. But yeah, I just wanted to say, so as you also mentioned, my research centers trauma discourses, and I'm particularly focusing on 2 case studies in Luxembourg and Australia. And essentially I work with racialized, well, mostly racialized activists in both spaces to see how they make meaning of trauma in the wake of racial violence and violent experiences related to race and racial injustice. And so yes, final lap of the research. So I'm happy to be here, and also happy to get feedback and comments from everyone.
Okay, that's great. So how I guess would you summarize the main objective of your research? I know you've spoken a little bit then about, you know, your field work, but you actually, your thesis is, shouldn't give it away too much, but it forwards I think a very impressive and sophisticated conceptual framework. So how do you bring together, and what do you see as the main objective of your work?
Yes, I think my main objective is really to like center what emerging trauma discourses are trying to tell us about racial violence. So my research particularly has kind of two sections. One is a conceptual framework where I've dived into how trauma has historically been discussed and researched. And in that sense, I've found, as most people might know, that typically trauma follows two genealogies, where one is centered around sociopolitical events and contexts like wars and disasters. And then on the other side, we have quite a dominant medicalized approach to trauma. Yet in recent times, we see trauma popping up in most spaces. A lot of people would say it's quite ubiquitous and overused and overdone. I recently even found articles on climate justice trauma. And so trauma is really entering into so many different spaces. But for me, what was really interesting is coming from my practice experience in like international development and working with different communities. I started to see trauma being used in ways that I hadn't been trained before on how to deal with. So particularly in the human rights field, in working with young people and LGBTQ people in Jamaica and also in Paris, they would often bring up trauma as, but in terms of the effect it would have on them in the wake of a particular experience of discrimination, but it wasn't quite medicalized, and so I was trying to understand that. Which brings me to like the second part of the research, which has that empirical inquiry aspect. So in that sense, I decided to do two case studies. One is in Luxembourg, where the activism space around racial injustice is very much new and emerging and started particularly after the murder of George Floyd. Whereas here in Australia, it's absolutely been an ongoing struggle historically. So I would say somehow in a nutshell, that's what my research focuses on.
I guess to follow on from that, I know your work looks very much at, so in constructing that kind of conceptual framework and trying to understand ideas of, not ideas, realities of social trauma in racialized communities, you focus a lot on the narration of trauma and kind of different forms of storytelling and how it is that trauma discourses come to be. I guess in this sense, I was actually just thinking then while you were talking that there are so many nowadays, so many different trauma discourses at play in society, yet at the same time, and we've spoken about this in terms of your scholarship and what I believe you are going to be forwarding and expanding, there's not actually, to my understanding, there's very few kind of, how do I put it, works conceptualizing racial trauma. And that this is, of course, particularly, as you said, since the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd, this has become more and more pertinent. So I guess I was just wondering, and it's so many different, the Black Lives Matter movement, so highly visual, other acts of injustice, highly visual, and in the past as well. Were there any particular visual, or I know also you talk about linguistic representations that were particularly important in your work, I guess conceptually, but then, you know, how did it play out perhaps in some of your field work, if you're able to share some of that?
Yeah, so first, to give a little bit more of the context of like how racial trauma has been formed in scholarship, it's been usually centered around this idea of interracial trauma, and that obviously has a function in terms of history of looking at the brutality of colonization and the lasting effect it's had on racialized communities. And that's typically the way that it's been centered and dealt with. Now, luckily, through the positioning of social movements as big, legitimate political actors in like modern society, we see more and more literature like coming up around
being
this.
expanded,
Yeah,
yeah.
so it's really being expanded now, albeit probably not to the extent it
Okay.
probably should be.
Mm.
But saying this to say, in terms of like the linguistics of it, I thought what was interesting, and it might sound obvious now in retrospect, but I think what was incredible for me in the field work is that unintentionally, because I had chosen to look at the research in activism spaces, the trauma deficit model that is so predominant in dealing with trauma and talking about its effect and how it ruins people's and memories and community and breaks. And that is absolutely true. But I think because of the nature of activism and the agency that it gives racialized groups, even in using trauma discourses, it almost comes coupled with acts of resistance and agency. And I think that's also been really important to note. And I see that coming up in the language of it. So, for example, especially here in Australia, typically communities, especially racialized communities, are led by the Indigenous community, and there's a lot of solidarity between different racialized groups here. And I would say you see both universalized like language being used, like no justice, no peace, but then also you have more contextual language like be sovereign and radical joy and something perhaps we'll like get into that later, but I also found it really interesting to see how in Luxembourg there is less of that culture of visual politics because the movement is so new and because activists are still very much struggling to be recognized as like legitimate actors in the political sphere. They're still very much in the space of over the past 6 years trying to even understand how to represent themselves as a political community. So I find the visuals to be less prominent in Luxembourg versus here.
Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't realize that it was it's really more in its infancy,
Yeah,
so anti-racism activism in Luxembourg.
yeah, since like 2018. So just yesterday, yeah.
Okay.
So very new.
I think another aspect that I find particularly important and interesting, and some of you, it's been a recurring sorry, a message has just come up on the computer here. It's been a recurring I'm not sure.
It's been a recurring theme.
Yes, in your research and in conversations we've had, but also what I was going to say is actually with this group over the past couple of years is the role of bodies and the links between bodies and bodies and visuals, bodies and sight. And so I guess I was wondering how your work, because I know that you're starting to look at, emergent theories of the body and trauma and the embodiment of trauma. I guess, have you found, or do you find that, is it quite an obvious link between visuality and bodies and solidarity between bodies? How do you find kind of those links playing out? Has your research got to that? I know it's sort of something that you were actually getting towards more at the end. In fact, you see Jordan's work looks to, I'm giving too many things away,
No, go for it.
but looks to, I feel, really expand understandings of trauma to focus on embodiment, bodies, and also sort of imagining ways forward. So I guess perhaps that's not really a question, but I can think of sort of two parts. One, sort of how bodies, the visuality of, I guess the visual dimensions of, I was going to say racial, anti-racial activism, but also as traumatized collectives coming together, how do they play out? And then also, how do you see bodies maybe bringing hope? Are there things other than are there things other than the reconstitution of trauma and racial trauma that perhaps bodies can in your does that make sense? No.
Yeah, no, totally. So as you said, I'm focusing on the embodiment aspect more directly closer to the end of my thesis, but I think that was also something that had surprised me because maybe from my social work training, it was I was more trained in understanding trauma's effect on the body as being a deficit and looking for kind of those visuals. And my idea going into the research is that art would be used as a way to have like therapy or reclaim that visual of the traumatized, racialized body. And that definitely came up in the research. But I would say what was actually even more interesting and surprising to me was the visuals were actually centered more like activist language. And so anything that was coming up, whether in the US in the BLM movement or in like other like allied countries in Luxembourg or here in the indigenous spaces, a lot of the visuals were sort of icons then of popular terms and phrases that were being used in the community. I would say the way though that bodies and this idea of embodiment and affect came up was more in discussing the relationship of trauma to like racialized violence and how the legitimacy of like violence against like Black bodies. I think that came up so much in my research, and it was really interesting to see how that's like continued to play out in different social justice movements that are still ongoing and happening throughout the course of like my research. I would also say something interesting that happened in Luxembourg in particular is that the activism space is quite feminized, and I'm not quite sure why yet. But it's predominantly run and started by women, and there haven't been a lot of men in that space. And I've then seen that come up and be reflected in like my research in the sense that a lot of the women often talk about then their reflections on how being silenced as a Black woman has had an effect on them in traumatic ways. But I think going back to the difference in how trauma works in political community, at least in the racial justice space, most of the visuals that communities use to represent themselves are trying to reclaim like the visuals of how Black bodies have been misrepresented. And so most of the visuals give back agency to the community. And so I've been quite surprised that, you know, in looking at these visuals, you wouldn't necessarily see trauma, at least in its conventional like sense. And so, yeah, it's been centered more on the language and cultural practices. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. We're going to move on to sort of talk about your case studies, actually, just to share it. I mean, you've just spoken a lot about them, but is there anything else in particular you'd like to emphasize, your key findings, or as you've spoken a lot about already, similar differences rather than similarities between Australia and Luxembourg? Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. Well, I would say in terms of like similarities, as trauma discussions are always spoken by activists as a way to represent or talk about their experiences of racialized violence. So in both case studies, that's been very like dominant and all of that. So it typically speaks about the ways in which violence is felt and experienced and how that pain is like carried through continuously. So that's been the common thread throughout both case studies, but what's been mind-blowing for me and really interesting that I hadn't quite seen before is how histories of colonialism affect different trauma discourses. And so in Luxembourg, they're currently still debating if Luxembourg even had a colonial past, because they didn't have any direct colonies.
I actually looked this up.
Yeah,
Because
it's really an interesting
Yeah.
debate that's like been happening, and the state has been reckoning with their participation in the genocide in Belgian Congo. And so it's that sort of still debate that's been ongoing, I think, poses a struggle to activists to try to legitimize that.
It was something actually like Luxembourg hasn't since 1300 and something or other actually hasn't itself enacted, I think, imperialism. We looked 13, I don't know.
Yeah, it's
1300s, yeah. But yet at the same time, sort of otherwise participated in other sort of thing. Yeah,
exactly. So then they participated in colonization through Belgium, and so versus here, that's a like settler colony. Continues to be, and so it's been really I think interesting to see how that's happened. And then also it's been interesting then to see how you know, as I said before, when I started the PhD, it was right after the murder of George Floyd, and now I'm ending it with the genocide in Palestine, and it's been interesting to see how like that plays into the racial justice activism space, because they're taking up those trauma discourses in further building solidarity and creating that, making those big points about racial violence is still an ongoing thing, because I think the big gap in racial trauma research is that it's because it's been positioned as being enacted through intergenerational trauma, it positions racial violence as something of the past. And I think what activists are trying to do is to, in expanding or attaching new meanings of trauma, showing that, oh, it's actually ongoing.
Yeah, of course.
Things
I found that really odd in this, you know, in working with, well, not odd working with you, but in working across this racial trauma space, that it's odd that you know, other areas, other different types of trauma, and traumatic histories and legacies have, in particular, I guess, you know, debates about its slavery in the US, for instance. There's been more of an understanding and reckoning that transgenerational trauma actually is emitted, and particularly in studies of the Holocaust, for instance. But in this space, it's not understood, that it doesn't seem to be well understood that it's actually not, it's not something of the past that can just be, it is just forgotten and everybody moves on, you know. Yeah, I found that something that it's quite, I have quite a lot of disbelief that it hasn't, but and that such, you know, injustices and discriminations can continue without here and otherwise. Look, I'm getting some movement from the Swiss timekeeper, but I did want to ask, we have a series of other questions which I'm sure you will all probably wish to ask as well, but I did just want to ask one more question, if I may. Roland and everybody, thank you. It was actually to move on to sort of some of actually the challenges or perhaps potentials or sensitivities involved with your research. I guess I was thinking about you in terms of your positionality, and we haven't actually spoken about this much, you know, which is remiss of me, I feel. But I guess I've been wondering what it's been like to do research on racial trauma as a Black female woman academic as well. I mean, I can imagine the types of affinities and solidarities that you must create are very difficult, but perhaps also, I know you've sort of mentioned that sometimes perhaps there are strengths associated with you doing a project such as this. You have particular inroads that might not be offered otherwise. So I guess I wondered, yeah, if what kind of challenges you faced or what kind of potentials you faced, but at the same time also, you know, what kind of strategies, just for everybody listening as well, like what kind of strategies have you employed to ensure that you are okay?
Good. I'm definitely, no, it's really been something that
I think I may ask.
No, I'm happy to talk about it because actually I think it's been so missing, as you said, like in the activism space. I remember I recently went to a conference and I presented, and afterwards, like an academic came to me and he was just like, I just find it interesting that you're in a room filled with white people talking about racial trauma for an hour and no one asked you about race. And I was like, oh, right, so interesting. And so I think it's come up for me in both ways, both on a personal level of looking at some of like the silencing that happens in academia, and also how little women of color are here anyways as well. And so it has that kind of, there's that level to it, but then there's also like being in the field, it can be quite complex where for me, I'm realizing that in some ways, I guess a bit of, what would I say is that word, like anger, in some ways motivates me. And so I think more or less I've been like, okay, and working in the field, I would say has been really complicated in the sense of, I think also being racialized gives me a sense of like understanding and also access. But then also I've been
professional social as a social
exactly,
worker as well.
exactly, yeah. And then also to being also being different and being racialized differently from some of the participants as well. So it's very complex and tricky where there have been a lot of overlaps and also a lot of differences. And yeah, that can be difficult to reckon with. And I will say it's been also interesting to sit with it when I go home in terms of now so much is like really happening and trying to understand how to like make sense of my research in the ongoing racial injustices in Sudan and Palestine and all these places. And so it's, I've been seeing my research almost everywhere now, and that can be overwhelming. But it also keeps me going to
hopefully
also
we
at the
will
same
keep you
time.
focused on your thing.
Yeah. And then afterwards, right? It's like it will
then you can
keep going to other
be
stuff.
free.
So yeah, we'll see.